public outreach with these things, because again, they're cheap enough that we entrust non-scientists, non-technical people to use them. So there's all these promises. So what I want to talk about today is I think what they now offer is actually we can start to do this source apportionment, which the algorithms, the understanding of how to do source apportionment's been there for decades, but it's not really done, as I said before, from a regulatory point of view, because it's just at the price point is too high. But now we have these devices that are cheap enough that we could potentially do regulatory source apportionment routinely if we can work out how to do it. So this is just a few examples of other low-cost networks. The famous one in London, Breve. Here's one in India, the Kanpur one, and here's the Airquo one, who we've got representative of over there. So that's the Gander one. So lots of these networks measuring air pollution spatially, temporally, over wide areas, doing really brilliant work. But wouldn't it be fantastic if we could then utilize these networks not only to tell how much air pollution there is, but actually where that air pollution came from? And so that's the vision I'm trying to sell to you today, I guess. So this is a graphic which I think many of you have seen some variant of before. So what's the promise of air pollution monitoring with sensors? So before, maybe you would have one regulatory site in your city. So you've got one monitor here. The dots here are meant to kind of represent, the concentrations of air pollution, but also the different sources of air pollution. And so you can see you get big gradients throughout the city, not only of concentrations, but also of where the air pollution came from. Just a cartoon, but that's the idea. So as we move forward using these sensor networks, so all the sensors are now these little black things here. And so again, this is this vision of the future. So not only can we put many more nodes, low-cost sensors in our cities, in static locations, like Raphael said, we can also put them on mobile devices, on cars, maybe even we start to put them on drones, but also we can start measuring indoors at the same time as we can measure outdoors. So we can see when we look at our indoor environments, how much of that air pollution is coming from outside, how much is it coming from those sources inside. And we spend a lot of time indoors. I don't know what the exact percentages are here in Ghana, but in the UK, we spend over 90% of our time indoors on average. So clearly indoor environments are super important for that exposure, even if the concentrations are lower inside compared to outside, because we spend so much more time inside, then those concentrations are really important. And again, those sources are really important. So these are just some example measurements. I think I won't dwell on this. This is, the typical sort of measurements you can get from sensors. Again, just trying to get air pollution levels. It doesn't tell us anything. Well, it does tell us something about sources. So this is some measurements I was involved with in Nairobi. So this is measuring at the roadside. That's measuring at an urban background site. And that's measuring at a rural upwind site. So already from there, you can get some sense of what the sources of air pollution are. So if you go close to the road and you see this huge jump in pollution, then you know, or at least logically, it seems very likely that roads are a big source of air pollution. So we already know one of the major sources, and we know that a lot of our exposure will be if we go next to these roads. So we can already do this sort of logical source apportionment, but is there a way we can do it more quantitatively going forward? And likewise, just an example of some work in Kampala on back of mobile taxis, so taxi services. Here's the Boda Boda, so here's one of the sensors on the back of the Boda Boda. So again, we can measure the air pollution as these things go around the city. Here we're just worried about absolute concentrations and what exposures are. But again, can we start to use these mobile devices to work out where the big sources are in the city? So can we start to paint that picture? So not only just by looking at concentrations, but using source apportionment, can we see where the pollution comes from? And I think here this would work very nicely with what Raphael was talking about earlier, to combine the two approaches. Similarly, this is just on a bus service in Ethiopia. So this is looking at indoor environments, but on public transport. And again, you can see how that varies through the city, and what you can see is that this indoor environment isn't just a function of the sources within the bus, so that's mainly the engine smoke coming through the bus, but it's also a function of where you are. So clearly you've got this outdoor pollution coming into your indoor environment, and so your exposure indoors isn't just due to those indoor sources, it's also a function of where you are and the outdoor sources coming through. So this isn't my slide. So this is, I think this is quite an interesting thing. So in the UK and Europe, I don't think it's got any further than this. So DPD, this is the logistics firm. You know, they deliver your parcels, but they've had this scheme where they've put air pollution sensors on the top of the vans. So again, this idea of being able to map out the city. Google cars have done something similar, but they tend to do this on a one-off basis. They measure a city and then that's it. Whereas if you've got a firm like DPD actually going around your city routinely dropping parcels off, so you get very good spatial temporal information of your city, or fairly good temporal information, they tend not to drive in the middle of the night, then maybe this is the place you could start to really put these technologies. So you've got this spatial temporal information, if we can get the sources from that. DPD like to do it because this is their corporate social responsibility, this is their money back to the communities. So that's just an aside, but I think that's quite exciting that you've got these big companies who are starting to think about how they can help with air pollution. Just got a lag on the lost my there we go. Okay, so let's get on to source assessment and apportionment. So I've already said most of this, but I think it's worth again reiterating. So successful air quality management and control not only requires the measurement of the air pollutants, it also requires information on where the pollutants come from. So what's their sources and what's the relative importance of those sources. And without this critical targeted information on pollution sources, it's difficult to plan and enact control measures with which to reduce air pollution. So that's the kind of first page of source apportionment. And if you go to the air quality management guidebook, not that there is a formal one, but if you go to any air quality management book, the first stage is to measure the pollution levels, the second stage is to know where the sources come from. Go to the next slide, please. And so there's various ways you can do source apportionment. So as I already said, some of it you can do logically, just by looking at the pollution, but there's various algorithmic approaches, and I'll talk about two in particular. So there's, first one is k-means clustering, so this is a clustering type approach. So this is more for a source identification method. It's used for working out when you have air pollution events. So it's used on many studies in the past on regulatory grade data. And then the other approach is this matrix factorization approach. So there's two types of positive matrix factorization and non-negative matrix factorization. Now, I'm not a mathematician, but in my mind, positive and non-negative is about the same thing. Okay? So that's a multivariate data analysis method commonly used for source apportionment and air quality studies using regulatory grade equipment. So again, both these things are very routine, been done for decades, but they haven't until recently been applied to low-cost data. You skip to the next slide, please. Okay, so I won't go over this in too much detail. So I'm an air quality person. I'm not a mathematician by training, but we use these techniques. But I won't go over the maths too much. A, because I'll quickly trip myself up and get the maths wrong, and also I think it's not the most interesting thing to do. The most useful thing is to know that there's these algorithms available, and if you want to go down this route, then this is the way you should be looking, and you'll get these slides afterwards anyway. But k-means clustering is an unsupervised learning technique. So essentially what you do is you look algorithmically at the data and you tell it how many types of air pollution clusters there are, and it separates it into what they think mathematically are the most distinct clusters. So you've got a choice, and with all these techniques, one of the difficulties with it is you have to choose how many air pollution sources you think there are. And at some level, that's an impossible task because there's a million air pollution sources out there. But there are main ones. So we could reasonably confidently, without having been to Accra before last night, I could reasonably confidently say there's regional air pollution, there's certainly a traffic-based air pollution, there's going to be local burning, so that's at least three. I'm sure there's more, but you could come up with a few sensible ones. So you have to choose, but you have to work your way through these different. Second approach, if we go to the next slide. So this is far too much information. The point of this slide, and please read it after I've been, but the point of this slide is to make that these algorithms have ways to optimize the number of clusters. And there's various mathematical ways you can do this. But again, is the red and the green lines don't necessarily agree. So what it boils down to at the moment, and maybe in the future, there's better algorithms to come. At the end, it will still rely on expert solicitation. At the end, you will still have to make a logical choice. You'll have to look at the outputs from the algorithms. You'll have to take into consideration, does this make sense? So, for example, looking at that traffic source, does that peak at the right time of the day for us to think it's traffic? So do we see a morning rush hour? Do we see an afternoon rush hour? So logically, does it make sense? If there's a wind component, so if there's a dust component, and so wind typically is stronger in the middle of the day. And so if there's a factor which we think is dust, do we see it increase as the winds increase in the middle of the day? If it doesn't, then logically, maybe it doesn't make sense for us to have that cluster. Okay? So if we go to the next slide, please. So that was k-means. And so the other one, we've got this PMF or NMF. And for the sake of this talk, I'm treating these two the same. So they're both multivariate data analysis methods. And so they're commonly used for source apportionment. And what they do is they take in different chemical information, and that chemical information might be particle sizes. We treat that as particle information or chemical information. And what again is it can separate this out. So this is a slide from Dan's work, which I'll get to again in a second. And I'll talk about that in thing. But they're the two options we're going to talk about. So if you go to the next slide. So just an overview. So we've got these two things I'll talk about today. There's other source apportionment approaches as well, but these are the two most common ones, or the three most common ones. So we've got k-means, we've got NMF, we've got PMF. So they're all descriptive models, and there's no objective criterion for the optimal number of factors. And so the solution you're going to end up choosing is the one that you think is best, okay? So it still needs that expert input, okay? And what it boils down to, I've said this already, but I think it's worth emphasizing, is what it boils down to is this logic type of problem, okay? And then my one hint, I guess, is if you're going to do these things, is my experience is keeping things simple. So you can tell these algorithms, look for 30 clusters, look for 30 factors, and it will find it because it's an algorithm, it will do it for you, okay? But you'll have no chance in trying to work out what those 30 factors are. So typically we don't get, I think the highest we've gone to is 8, and even that's a mess. So you have to start combining these things. Okay, so that's the theory side over. So now I'll give you some examples of where we've done this, where other people have done this as we go through. And skip forward, please. In the size distribution of particles. And again, this is very well known. So this is a typical size spectrum of what particle distribution looks like. So we know with PM, so we're happy talking about PM10, we're happy talking about PM2.5, we might be happy talking about PM1. So PM10, less than 10 microns, PM2.5, less than 2.5 microns, PM1, less than 1 micron. So, but it's not just that, there's particles in all different sizes. And the nice thing about all these particles in all different sizes, we can see this distribution, and that tells us already that there's different sources. And in very simple brushstrokes, the really small stuff is gases turning into small particles, so nucleation type events. The slightly bigger stuff is oxidation, so combustion type aerosols. The slightly bigger stuff is older combustion aerosols, and they've grown bigger. And then the really big stuff